So we're going to take it slowly for a couple of minutes just to allow more and more guests to join us. I'm Mike Pothier. I'm the Program Manager of the Catholic Parliamentary Liaison Office, the CPLO, which is one of the organizations co-hosting this morning's event. And we are collaborating with the Dullah Omar Institute at the University of Western Cape, with the South African Research Chairs Initiative, Chair in Multilevel Government, and the whole event is sponsored by the Hans Seidel Foundation. So my thanks to all of those organizations for combining to put together this event. Special word of thanks to Professor Tinashe Chigwata of the Dullah Omar Institute, who has done the lion's share of the organizing of this event, finding the speakers, etc., and for some reason handed over to me to moderate. We have 75 people with us now, more and more, 79 people. More and more joining all the time, so I'm going to waffle a little bit just to give everyone an opportunity to join us. The usual little administrative announcements to start with. We are recording this event, and the recording will later be made available on the Dullah Omar Institute's website. We assume that by continuing in the event, you are okay with it being recorded. I'd like to ask everybody to use their real names. Use your real names when you sign in so that we know who everybody is. And it also helps to avoid sometimes those people who join these events solely in order to cause trouble of one sort or another or share undesirable material one way or the other. It's a very large group. We had over 500 people registering for this event. And unfortunately, not everybody is always here with the best of intentions, and it helps then if people use their own names. You will find in the chat box shortly the usual link to a brief evaluation. You know how it works. We want to hear your impressions of the event, your suggestions for other topics to be covered, etc., etc. It's useful for us as the organizing groups, but also for our sponsors who have to report back to their funders, in this case back in Germany. So please do take an opportunity towards the end of the event to fill that in. It's very, very quick. You would also have received yesterday probably, or whenever you received the link for the event, a copy of the paper that goes with this event, Unpacking the 2024 Government of National Unity in South Africa, Challenges, Opportunities, and Lessons for Stable Coalition Governance. If anybody didn't receive that, please just make a note of it in the chat box, and we'll ensure that you get a copy of that paper published by, once again, the Dullah Omar Institute. And no doubt much of the discussion this morning will cover some of the ground that's in that paper as well. Right, we're up to 89 people. I think I'm going to wait till we get to 100 and then start to go into the formal proceedings. I'd also ask you, please, to make sure that you keep your video off and keep yourself muted until the time comes for the general discussion. This is in the meeting format and not the webinar format, so we can get all sorts of interruptions if people are not muted and keep their videos on. Once again, with such a large crowd, that can become a little bit difficult. You have seen the list of speakers that we have. I'm happy to say that 4 of the 5 speakers have joined us at the moment, and we are hoping for the 5th one to join shortly. Professor Jaap, who is the National Research Chair in Multilevel Government, Law and Development at the Dullah Omar Institute, will kick us off. Then we have Professor Joleen Steyn Kotze, who's Chief Research Specialist at the HSRC. Our third speaker will be Lukhona Mnguni, the Acting Executive Director of the Rivonia Circle. And then we have Dr. Nonhlanhla, who is a lecturer in the Faculty of Law at Northwest University. And then I'm very happy to say that we have with us also Dr. Conrad Bosire, an independent consultant, law professor, and former chief of staff in the Kenyan Judiciary, obviously to speak to us about the experience of a government of national unity in another country. So we have some sort of a comparative angle. Okay. I think at this point, we need to make a start. We're 7 minutes past the hour. People will no doubt be joining us as we carry on. But I'm going to hand over now to a representative of our sponsoring organization, the Hans Seidel Foundation, and that is Karen April, who is based in their Johannesburg office. Karen, over to you for a few words of introduction.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Mike. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, good morning. On behalf of the German Hans Seidel Foundation, allow me to express our gratitude to the Dullah Omar Institute and the Catholic Parliamentary Liaison Office for our long-standing trusting partnership and for organizing this much anticipated seminar. Allow me also to share greetings from our resident representative, Hans Bühler, who can't be with us today. The past weeks since the 29th of May have truly been an intense time. A time of serious concerns and learning, of frank and thoughtful debating, a time of transition and of new beginnings that affect us all. Undoubtedly, there is a mammoth task ahead, and I'm sure our speakers will reflect on the opportunities and probably even the risks as well. But at the beginning of such a seminar, it's worthwhile remembering once again, although the elections were hotly contested, they took place in a free and fair spirit, and maybe even more importantly, they were peaceful. And although the political leaders were under immense time pressure, a new parliament was constituted and a multi-party coalition formed, the Government of National Unity. Many observers agree that this is a serious achievement for South Africa's young, maturing democracy. And considering the different programmatic focus areas of the parties involved, some even argue that some parties put the interest of the country before the interest of their parties. Certainly, this new administration represents a unique opportunity to address the urgent challenges the country is facing. In this seminar, we will also reflect particularly on the impact the GNU might have on subnational level, the provincial and local government level. And we all know we need to strengthen our municipalities urgently. And it will be crucial for the GNU's success to achieve progress in this area. It is particularly on the local government level where many citizens can feel change closely and where the GNU can prove itself as well. President Cyril Ramaphosa spoke of the joint commitment to build a capable, ethical, and developmental state. And so it is very timely that this seminar today explores the impact of the GNU on governance, intergovernmental relations, and local government. So thank you very much to all the speakers for sharing your expertise and insights, and to all participants for joining this conversation today. We really look forward to the inputs and to the discussion. Mike, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Once again, just a request to guests, please to keep your video switched off and keep yourself muted, obviously not the speakers, until the time comes for our discussion. It struck me also that purely coincidentally, really, we are exactly 1 calendar month today after the announcement of the GNU on the 30th of June. Here we are on the 30th of July. So an appropriate time to, I think, start to analyze and try to understand some of the implications of this. And the first speaker, whom I'm going to invite now to do exactly that, is Professor Jaap de Visser, chair in the Multilevel government at the Dullah Omar Institute. And Jaap is going to speak primarily on what the GNU means for stable governance, for intergovernment relations, and for devolution. Jaap, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mike, and good morning to everyone. Thanks so much to all the efforts that everyone has put into convening this webinar. Thanks to my colleagues at CPLO and Dullah Omar Institute, in particular, Prof. Ngcobo for being the driving force behind convening this webinar, and of course our funders, my fellow panelists, and everyone who took the time to join us this morning. Thanks so much for allowing me the opportunity to make a few brief remarks at the beginning of this webinar. I'll keep it quite brief because I'm really curious to hear from my fellow panelists this morning. Just to kick us off on a few of the topics that Mike mentioned. So as Karen indicated, these are important, uncertain, and exciting times. We have the outcome of the elections. We have a government of national unity, which, you know, I would almost call it a GNU light. It's not really a government of national unity in the proper sense of the word, because of course it doesn't cut across the full spectrum of political parties. But there it is, what's in the name. It is definitely a broad spectrum of political parties that have joined the government of national unity. And it's really promising and exciting to see what's going to be lying ahead. And I want to echo Karen's point about the immense achievement that the formation of this government of national unity has been, despite all the the remarks that we may have and the criticism that we may have. And it's a remarkable and very impressive achievement in a short space of time against all odds. So a lot of positives to be said about what has happened so far. It's also a steep learning curve for South Africa on national coalition making. Of course, many of us had been vested in the topic for quite some time, particularly given what's been happening at local government level, with coalitions. But now the issue of coalition making and sustaining coalitions, I think, is firmly on everyone's agenda who has an interest in governance. At the same time, there's also things happening in the local government sphere, with a bill on the table that's dealing with some of the legislative issues around coalitions, introducing a threshold, abolishing the secret ballot for election of office bearers and motions of no confidence, limiting the motions of no confidence, publishing coalition agreements, and imposing proportionally composed executive committees. So quite a number of things happening, also suggestions being made, proposals being discussed on how we can improve the governance framework in local government to improve the stability of coalitions. And of course, there are lots of lessons that must be learned, that will be learned from this, also in the national and provincial sphere. So what we did is we put together a paper as a background paper to this webinar, which is available and which has been sent to you. And I want to acknowledge my co-authors, the lead author, Ms. Ngcobo, who's also in the room today, and my co-author, Prof. Ngcobo. And we tried to, in this paper, record some of the events of the last couple of weeks and make some remarks and suggestions as to how things are going to unfold. Now, there's lots of things to be said about the Government of National Unity, or the GNU Light, as I would call it, the formation of it and its prospects of success. Many things to be said. The one point that I want to make is that the way in which the GNU was put together is really I would say it's the South African way of doing things. It's unique, and it is also, for those of us who had been vested in debates about coalitions and doing research on coalitions, we seem to have done everything in the reverse order compared to many countries that have practiced coalitions for a very long time, particularly the countries that practice coalitions in a system of proportional representation, which is this electoral system that we have. Because normally in those countries, you have an electoral outcome, The first thing that happens is there's negotiations amongst political parties that have an appetite to work together towards a common policy or a common government program. Once that is agreed upon, they find a leader of government in the form of a prime minister or a leader of government. And once that leader of government has been found, we populate the rest of the government. And in South Africa, it was almost the exact reverse. There was an electoral outcome, and the first thing that was done is to find a leader of government, electing the president. President then populated the government with members of the Government of National Unity, and then negotiations towards a real policy program ensued and are arguably still happening. Now, this is not a judgment that this is the wrong way to do it. It should have been the other way around. This may very well work, and this is a South African way of concluding a coalition or a government of national unity at the national level. And there was also very little other choice because the Constitution puts the 14-day deadline for the election of the president. So there was no other way of doing it other than to start with the election of the president. However, in terms of learning from this experience and what does it mean for the future and how will it guide us going forward, is the one thing is that we now can all accept that a electoral outcome that doesn't provide a outright majority for any specific party is a real possibility. Anyone who was doubting that it could be a possibility, I think, should now have come across and realize that this is what our electoral system means, that the outcome of the elections at national, provincial, and local government level can be, well, you can call it a scrambled egg. And what then happens? And how do we arrive at some sort of methodology or protocol or convention of going about forming a government? Because at this point in time, it's a government of national unity, arguably on the basis of the argument that this is a very special time. And some people even use the word crisis, and comparisons are made with the government of national unity that was established in 1994 to pull the country out of a very difficult situation. One can have doubts as to whether that comparison is really valid, because obviously the kind of crisis that South Africa was in the early 90s can't be compared with the problems that we have now. Yet the argument could be the government of national unity is there to pull the country out of a very difficult situation. But we can't have that argument every 5 years. Some sort of normalization of coalition politics is also necessary, that we cannot always rely on this kind of broad-based call for national unity as the only way to formulate coalitions. So one of the questions that I had in the first 2 or 3 weeks after the outcome of the elections is who is holding the space of coalition negotiations? Who is actually mediating, convening, chairing? Is there some sort of neutral person in the background, or persons or team that brings together the parties that may work together? And also importantly, who is keeping the public informed of what is happening? Because what we saw happening in practice is that political parties were engaging and also informing the public of their views of the engagement. Letters were leaked. Political party leaders were giving their own views on the negotiations. And for many of us, the sense was that the negotiations were partly being held through the media and in public. Of course, a lot of talks happened behind the scenes, but there was a lot of information that was also shared in the public. And it came across a little bit as, I won't say amateurist or unprofessional, that would not be a fair term to use. But we were wondering, I think some of us were wondering, who is holding that space and who is mediating, convening, and chairing? Another question that comes up is, what is going to be the common policy program that holds governments together? The statement of intent obviously provides some information, but doesn't provide a lot of detail on what the common policy program is. And the risk is going to be that we're going to see little enclaves in government formed based on whatever party political allegiance that particular member of the executive has. And how is the president and the presidency going to avoid that from happening and ensure coherence in cabinet? I think that's going to be a very important issue going forward. Now, part of my duty this morning is to make a few remarks about intergovernmental relations and the impact of the GNU on intergovernmental relations. Now, intergovernmental relations, the relationships between levels of government, spheres of government, is a weak point in our government. Many of our service delivery failures stem from inadequate IGR. Projects get stuck, funding gets stuck, disputes bedevil relationships and hold back service delivery, because between spheres of government, there is a lot of static, there is a lot of tension, there's a lot of delay. We now have coalition governments at all three levels of government, at all three spheres of government. We have a GNU that is intended in its ambition to resonate throughout government. It's what I would call an umbrella coalition that is supposed to resonate throughout government. Will this now improve intergovernmental relations? Is this going to be the warm blanket of cooperation between the three levels of government that everyone has been waiting for? Will it obviate, will it make unnecessary the need for IGR systems and structures, for the President's Coordinating Council, for the meetings between the Minister and the provincial MECs? Will it obviate the DDM, the District Development Model? Will it obviate dispute resolution mechanisms between levels of government? Will we see less disputes and disagreements between national, provincial, and local governments? Will projects get unstuck? Will we see a more adequate distribution of responsibilities between spheres of government? For example, the topic of devolution of powers to provinces and cities that can and want to take greater responsibility. Is all of that going to be unlocked because of the GNU? Will we see a devolution of commuter rail to the city of Cape Town that has been requesting and clamoring for that particular function? Will we see more policing powers going to provinces? Both Gauteng and the Western Cape have been making noises and moves to say we want to take greater responsibility for policing. Will that be the result of the government of national unity with this broad-based participation across all political parties, including the two major, let's say, antagonists party in our system, the ANC and the Democratic Alliance? Will all of that now be covered by a warm blanket of national unity? Now, maybe it will. And, you know, the early signs are, of course, very promising. And there's a lot of goodwill, a lot of political goodwill that emanates from the government of national unity. And we must be positive about that. We must be excited about that. And we must give it time to see the follow through. But I want to make a few cautionary remarks and maybe express a bit of skepticism. Because I, for one, do not think that it is wise to rely on political party or coalition alignment for a functional intergovernmental relations. I think that would be a wrong approach. We must continue to improve the intergovernmental relations system. We must continue to work doggedly, perhaps, at all those systems and structures that are part of our intergovernmental architecture. Because the political party and coalition alignment, by its very nature, can be, will be, maybe temporary. It's not a fixed arrangement. Politics can change. Coalition dynamics can change and can fall apart on the basis of one particular crisis. Also, even if different organs of states across the system of government used to belong to the same political party, intergovernmental relations would often still not work properly. So there's work to be done on the system of intergovernmental relations, regardless of the existence of the government of national unity. Also, the government of national unity umbrella doesn't cover every sphere of government and every organ of state. It cannot. There are outliers. There are governments where one party is in charge. So, for example, it remains to be seen to what extent the government of, let's say, Limpopo, where the ANC has 48 out of 64 seats in the provincial legislature, will feel bound by a GNU. There are also governments where other coalitions were formed, are being formed outside of the GNU umbrella. Of course, Gauteng and the existing coalitions in local government in Gauteng being very clear examples of that. And to some extent, this is inevitable. The electoral outcome and the local and provincial politics will perhaps lead into a different direction. And that is something that we need to actually respect and accept. The integrity and autonomy of local and provincial democracies must also be respected. I don't think it's feasible to have a national political agreement that is going to be followed through at each and every organ of state and every level of government. So there will always be outliers. There will be organs of state, levels of government that do not follow neatly the GNU politics. The last point I want to make is that a lot of the issues that bedevil intergovernmental relations are technical and bureaucratic. Yes, political will is essential, and a well-willing or a listening ear and political willingness at the top is extremely important, but there will always be the issues of the budgets and the grants and the planning and the infrastructure projects that need to be unlocked through technocratic and bureaucratic intergovernmental relations. And that still remains an issue where a lot of improvement is necessary. So the signs are promising, and certainly a greater political willingness through the Government of National Unity concept to listen and to engage across political party divides is promising, and is perhaps what the country is needing. But my warning remark is that we should not rely on party political alignment or coalition alignment for healthy intergovernmental relations, but that we need to keep improving the systems of intergovernmental relations that need to endure even beyond the lifespan of the Government of National Unity. All right, with those remarks, I hope I gave some food for thought, and I'll hand back to you, Mike. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed, Jaap. You mentioned there towards the end of your input that much of it depends on technical and bureaucratic issues, which is of course true, but to lead us into the next speaker, I think a lot of it also depends on the question of values. And I think we saw such a lot of rhetoric about people's claims to different values in the run-up to the announcement of the GNU, or the backwards and forwards, and all the accusations that were being thrown around. So the question of values is important, and our next speaker is going to address that. Professor Joleen Steyn-Kotze from the Human Sciences Research Council. Joleen, if you'd like to switch on your video and join us for your presentation. Thank you. You were still mute, Joleen.
Thank you. Clearly, I'm not caffeinated enough this morning. Thank you very much for the kind invitation and also allowing us some space, to talk around questions of governments of national unity. And I think especially in a South African context, kind of uncharted territory of coalitions at a national level. And also building on some experiences that we had seen, looking at the local government level and how cooperation and or the politics of collaboration was severely lacking and started on questions of governance. So my remarks I'm going to really try and keep them short and sweet in the interest of time, one. And two, also maybe posing some questions just that we can start a nice dialogue around some of the, I would say, often overlooked and softer issues that impact whether a GNU or a coalition or an elite pact is successful or not. I like the characterization of a GNU light, and I must confess it brought a smile to my face, because when we look at the formation of South Africa's particular government of national unity following the 2024 general elections, where we saw no outright winner, I found it particularly strategic from a political dynamics point of view that the African National Congress came forward and invited people or parties who are interested in working with that particular political party to come together and to sit around a table. So I think it was really very strategic from a political dynamics point of view, not to necessarily start creating a narrative of picking and choosing who the ANC is going to work with, but rather having this very open invitation. And I think that is what made our particular elite coalition quite unique. It also bears on the question who is leading. Ultimately, we have to bear in mind, I believe, that our particular Government of National Unity, or GNU Light, is an elite pact. And we have to bear in mind, throughout the formation of this elite pact, it was very much political party driven. So political elites drove that process that cobbled together this coalition, or this a team of collaborators, if one wants to call it that, that will now drive forward our national development plans, policies, policy implementation. And I think there, for me, the interesting conversation that needed to happen is around values. What are our elite values? And when we start looking at South Africa's political landscape, we very often note our dynamics, or our particular political dynamic, is rooted in antagonism. When opposition political parties engage one another, it is not necessarily a very friendly, collaborative conversation, but really an antagonistic one that at times borders on intolerance, which we have looked at and written about before. So when you start looking at this collaborative space now within the GNU Light, and I'm sorry, I am stealing that term for today, the question then becomes are political elites able to shift their ways of doing politics to a new way of doing politics, given that the particular situation they find themselves in requires a politics of compromise and of collaboration? And for me, I think the jury is very much still out on that question, predominantly if we consider, as was touched upon earlier, what are the media leaks, for example, the letters, very much a harsh rhetoric as well from some political parties about, well, if this one joins, then we will exit because we cannot work with that one. And, it didn't really set the stage, I think, very well in my mind for creating the space needed for that politics of collaboration. And I think for me, that is then where it starts to become critical, because we have an elite-driven pact formation on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you have very diverse worldviews, ideological views, policy priorities that these political parties are bringing to the table. So how are you going to cobble out what the priority areas are on the one hand, and on the other hand, how are you going to tackle those priority areas? And for me, I think what is quite telling is that there wasn't much of a conversation around what the policy compromise positions could be for political parties when one just does a broad cursory glance of their election manifestos. And I'll use the example around the question of land, for example. So we know that the ANC and the DA have very, very diverse views and ideologies around private property ownership, around the role of the state, within questions of land redistribution, around economic activity, and so forth. And when I was looking through all these election manifestos, I think what stood out for me was that different political parties bring different elements, and those different elements could very well create a position of compromise that could keep political role players happy in pursuing their policy directives. So for me, on the question of land, the one political party's manifesto, that of the IFP, pointed towards a state land audit to get an overview of what the situation around land redistribution is, for example, in state-owned land. And I thought that could be a particularly useful policy compromise position around which political actors could, of course, converge. Of course, the question remains, will that happen? And I think it was touched upon, specifically the question around what is the common policy program? What is the focus for the next 5 years? We have big rhetoric around job creation, poverty alleviation, societal transformation, reducing inequality. But I think those big ideas need to come down to a very specific policy position, which, as we know, different political actors have different ideological lenses on how they want to tackle those critical policy issues and policy priorities. So, to what extent then will our political elites in this elite-driven pact, in this GNU light, start shifting and working towards that policy compromise? It came up a little bit earlier as well around who is holding this GNU together, who is driving, how does one ensure public participation within this GNU space that, again, in its formation, in its dialogue, is very, very much an elite-driven pact. And I think for me, that is where the murky ground and the danger lies. We have seen at a local government level where political parties are unable to find the politics of collaboration, to find the necessity of compromise. We have seen governance collapse as a result of that, due to an inability of political elites within the local government space, for example, to effectively and collaboratively work together. And I think for me, that is the big gap. If you want to create that coherence within cabinet, you are going to have to make some serious compromises, not just on a policy front, but also on an ideological front. And I think it's going to be quite interesting to see to what extent ministers within different departments or ministries are able to work collectively with other ministers and other ministries that they do need to collaborate with in order to set forth that coherent policy directive towards the big goals around poverty alleviation, job creation, inequality reduction, societal transformation, and I think critically as well, political stability. So linking to that, we have elite values on the one hand that very much impact on how the GNU is going to work. And we have seen some, I would say, antagonistic forms of engagement that has kind of characterized the build up to this GNU formation. Now we need to find a shift towards the politics of collaboration. And again, the question for me is to what extent we will see our political elites being able to shift their values around, for example, compromise, cooperation, being able to work with a political party or with a political entity that one doesn't really necessarily agree with, but have to engage on the basis of, we need to agree to disagree on certain aspects, but let's see if we can cobble out a strategy in order to deal with a specific issue. I saw a question pop up in the chat and I'm a bit distracted by it. So with permission, I'm just quickly going to answer an elite pact versus a non-elite pact is the South African political system, I would argue, is very much elite driven. And by elite driven, I'm talking about individuals that have access to political power. So you're looking at your high-ranking members within a political party that are able to almost make decisions on behalf of the South African population. And again, we are in a PR system, a proportional representation system. And by virtue of being in that system, we effectively give a mandate, or the public gives a mandate to political parties to make those decisions. We did not, for example, have a referendum or some sort of broad-based public consultation around what the nature of the GNU would be. And I think with that, I'm just going to conclude with some questions around what are some of the key critical values around cooperation, collaboration, and setting forth our policy priorities that will give us that coherence in cabinet. Ultimately, we do need that coherence in cabinet to facilitate political stability. And I think we have seen and hopefully learned the lessons of the local government level that if you do not have coherence around policy directives, around an implementation plan, I would go as far as to say around a collective goal around which political parties can mobilize, then we may very well start finding that governance instability at a national level that could potentially start laying the foundation for more deep-rooted and more serious levels of political instability. And I think with that, I am at my 15-minute mark, if I'm not mistaken. And I am going to hand over.
Thanks very much, Joleen. Thank you to you and to Jaap also for sticking to that 15 minutes. That's great. Our next speaker was supposed to be Lukhona Mnguni from the Rivonia circle. Now, I have been on the phone to Lukhona in the background trying to ensure that he joins, and I think he must have some sort of problem connecting because he has the link and he hasn't been able to join. But fortunately, we have lots of other speakers, so I'm going to now hand over to the next one in the list, and that is Dr. Nonhlanhla Ngcobo from the University of the Northwest University. And we've asked Nonhlanhla to speak in particular about what the GNU means for local government and for service delivery. So, Nonhlanhla, you are sharing your screen. We can see that, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think it just started. This is where I needed to start. Yes. Thank you for the platform. I must say, when I was approached to speak on this topic of the GNU, I thought to myself, I don't know where I would begin. It's really something that's been of interest to me. Of course, for politics of provincial and national government, but then I really had not given it that much thought in terms of local government, because this is certainly my research focus, local government. So I had to really go back and revisit. Let's look really at what the Constitution tells us local government should look like, and it will really pave the way for me, as well as and I'm hoping for everybody else, to really then understand what this impact that we speak of the GNU in matters, particularly of local government. So I will really start with really asking what the status of local government is in South Africa. And I'm speaking now ideally from what the Constitution tells us. And I like that Professor Jaap the Visser really gave us an intro into this very slide that I'll speak to. We understand that local government in South Africa is very much different to what we had pre-1994. The Constitution has really cemented what we know local government to be, which is a sphere that is quite unique in the sense that both its executive and legislative authority is vested with just one particular structure, which is your municipal council. And what is interesting about that is that the structure that we speak of holds so much power that it is the structure that ought to decide what happens within its own municipalities. So it's very interesting because it is exactly the same constitution that has allowed local government to be infiltrated by politics as we know them. And I suppose the ideal, I often say, the ideal with giving local government the kind of status that it has was that we, or the government perhaps, or the drafters of the Constitution, were really trying to ensure that we get this participatory and representative democracy coming in to ensure at least that service delivery is one thing that can be accessed by all that needed, particularly your previously disadvantaged communities. So the ideal here is to have those parties that pre-1994 had no voice to now come in and have a voice. If the people vote in the people that they need, it is those people that will ensure service delivery ultimately happens. And I speak so much about the service delivery because I very much believe that this GNU impact will particularly be on whether local government can continue to provide services and where there's a complete breakdown in local government, whether this GNU will be able to really bring back or to rebuild local government as we know it today. So of course then, the whole notion or the whole issue of politics influencing local government is the one thing that I had to sit down and really question. Granted, yes, we've always known that politics is the party, is perhaps the word of the day. But the politics that we're expecting are politics that should happen only within local government. But when I did a study, I concluded a study that I had been doing for 3 years. And I found there, of course, that there's a number of politics that come in and influence what is happening in local government. Again, Prof. Jaap the Visser spoke about this, how there's undesired politics coming from national and provincial government, infiltrating and influencing what happens in local government. But there's also politics that are coming in from the political parties themselves. There's the political structures and provincial structures of political parties coming in and disrupting in a way the workings of what we call a sphere that is supposed to be executing its own powers without any compromise or without any influence or impediment from any other structure. I did a very unique study where I not only relied on literature that is out there, there's ample literature, there's ample case law that tells us exactly what is happening in terms of disturbance within local government matters. But I also did a unique study where I went and visited councillors from various municipalities around South Africa. And what I found was that there's a shared sentiment really in how there is certainly an influence of party leadership, national and provincial, coming into the works of municipalities, local and provincial government coming into works or coming into disturb perhaps what's happening. But there's also the issue of party caucuses, which I found very interesting, where you find that an individual councillor, guided, for instance, by the code of conduct that we find in the Municipal Systems Act, would also be influenced by party caucuses that often also find their mandate in the national and the provincial structures of their own political parties. This means, for instance, that a councillor might have to vote for what their party wants this councillor to vote for in a municipal sitting, as opposed to a councillor doing what is required of them as soon as they become a councillor, and which is for them to abide by the code of conduct for councillors. This code of conduct tells us that a councillor should always act in the best interest of their municipality, but often then a councillor would have to act in the best interest of their political party. And this has often been the case in what we're seeing in local government, which is coalition governments in local government. The two speakers, both professors, definitely spoke about how coalitions have really shown us how local government structure can be dismantled in a day based on coalition governments not going the right way, or perhaps the agreements that are set up not being met. When you go back to literature, I often speak of an example, for instance, of a party influencing what happens in local government. When I speak of what happened in Cape Town, when Day Zero was announced, and the provincial, or rather the national chairperson, the president of a Democratic Alliance at that time, Mmusi Maimane, he comes in and he tells people that he will be in charge of a function that is primarily a function of a mayor and the mayor's council, with that time being Patricia de Lille. Again, we see how a national president, how we see a national president of a political party comes in and takes over the functions of a city. So yeah, there's also the issue of double standards, for instance, and again, this would be a national government now, where a national government or a provincial government would come in prematurely and try and control a municipality. Using Section 139, for instance, of the Constitution, if you look at that section, it speaks on interventions where there's been a breakdown in the municipality, where municipality is failing to function. A provincial government comes in and places that municipality under intervention, under administration. And so this can also be a tool, and it's been used in the past as a tool where a municipality is placed prematurely under this intervention, purely in an effort to control a municipality that might not be governed by the party that is governing the provincial government. So it's all of these that then make me question whether this government of national unity that we speak of versus the coalitions that we've seen, versus the interventions, or not rather versus the conflicts that we've seen in coalition, whether this GNU can really be something that works. And for me, I immediately thought of the provincial, what's happening provincially, and whether this GNU that is happening can be cascaded into the local sphere. So we've seen coalitions, not so much work that's helped our municipalities. GNU, the question then becomes, for instance, will it help our municipalities to function better? So immediately I thought of Gauteng, where we saw that, yes, we have a GNU come in nationally, but it was not duplicated in Gauteng. The premier, the Banyaza Lesufi, did not come to an agreement with the Democratic Alliance, for instance, for them to form what could be called a provincial GNU. And that for me immediately makes me wonder whether this will be good or bad for the cities in Gauteng. I'm thinking particularly the Ekurhuleni, I'm thinking with Tshwane and Johannesburg, in fact, all three of these metros. I do wonder that in the absence of this GNU, the provincial GNU, will it help the municipalities to stabilize? Because in the absence of a provincial GNU remains coalition governments. And I'm speaking now of coalition governments in the provincial space, again, definitely going to intervene in matters of the city of Johannesburg, Tshwane, as well as of Ekurhuleni. But then you've got the GNU mirroring or cascading into a province such as KwaZulu-Natal. And there you ask yourself that for the first time, will the Democratic Alliance, the ANC, the IFP, and the National Freedom Party, will they be able to then work together and influence municipalities in a good way? I'm thinking, for instance, eThekwini, yes, granted, EFF is still there, very much a strong party, but they remain in the opposition. But will eThekwini benefit from a provincial government of national unity? Will Mnguni benefit from such a provincial government of national unity? I am optimistic, especially thinking about the political killings that have plagued KwaZulu-Natal. And those political killings, of course, we know to be predominantly councillors that are losing their lives in KwaZulu-Natal because of the politics of opposition that have been happening. So perhaps this government of national unity will allow the cascading of the ideal of uniting this broken society to trickle into the municipal councils in KwaZulu-Natal, and perhaps even for provincial and national governments to be able to speak to their mayors or the people in charge of the municipalities to really be able to come together and follow what for now really is a statement of intent. I think Prof. Jaap the Visser mentioned that there's nothing really on paper much for now, except for the statement of intent. And there I found that only really just there's only one paragraph that speaks to local government, and that is an ideal for this government of national unity to unite and to rebuild. That is the one word that I saw, that the intention is to stabilize local government. We don't know what stabilize means at this point. Does it mean that there will be less intervention coming from these structures in matters of local government? Does it mean that more assistance will be given? And what really will it mean for the status of local government that, according to the Constitution, should always remain a government that has its independence within the interdependence, the whole intergovernmental relations framework. So yes, these are my many thoughts in this matter, but I believe we're only a month in, so it's still early days. One remains very much vigilant to what will come up of this. But thank you very much, Chair, for indulging me this morning.
Thank you, Nonhlanhla. Thank you very much. It wasn't an indulgence at all. It was great to hear your insights, and particularly, the effects on local government, where, as we know, so many problems around service delivery issues. As you say, we have to wait and see how this plays out and what effect it's going to have. You touched on the provincial unity situations, both in Gauteng and KZN, and that is something that we've asked our next speaker to focus on as well. I'm very happy to say that Lukhona Mnguni, Acting Executive Director of the Rivonia Circle, has now joined us. And we asked Lukhona to give us his thoughts on two particular aspects. One is just to reflect on our previous government of national unity back in 1994, and what lessons we can draw from that, how we can sort of compare and contrast that situation to the one that we have now. And then, yes, the provincial level. Why is it that in KZN, it seemed that the parties, the ANC, DA, IFP, and the NFP as well, found each other very quickly after these last elections and formed a provincial unity government? It seemed very smoothly, whereas in Gauteng, that didn't happen. Why was that? And again, what lessons can we draw from that? So, Lukhona, you're with us. Please switch on your video, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Michael, and good morning to colleagues. Well, I suppose it's always interesting to go back to 1994. I'm not sure, somebody is trying to control my camera.
No,
It's
you're
always
okay. You
very
can go ahead.
interesting. No. It's always very interesting to go back to 1994 because that government of national unity was constitutionally mandated by the 1993 interim constitution. And it actually created thresholds in terms of participation in the government of national unity. So you needed to get a particular percentage of the seats of the National Assembly in order to be in the government of national unity. It was about 10%. You needed to get 20% to be considered as deputy president. And so many people sometimes think that, de Klerk was deputy president to Madiba jointly with Thabo Mbeki simply because it was an attempt at unity, but actually the National Party had met the thresholds that were developed in the government of national unity by the interim constitution. And that's why the National Party, well, the new National Party, then left in 1996 when the current constitution was adopted, and it did not make provision for a government of national unity, but the IFP remained behind because, as I've done in a chapter for marriages of inconvenience with Prof. Suzanne Boysen, to try and really track the coalitions in KwaZulu-Natal. And I come to the conclusion that, these coalitions are better off when there's something that ties multi-layers of the spheres of government. So the IFP remained in the national government of in the government of national unity, and then of course in KwaZulu-Natal between 1994 and 2004, in actual fact, the IFP was in charge in that province for some time. And that tying up of the coalitions is important, and I think that's the first lesson we can take from we can take from the 1994 experience to say that when there's multi-level of coalitions, it creates for a much more better stability. And I think Nonhlanhla was alluding to that fact about Gauteng, for example, that now in this instance, Gauteng has decided to, create its own arrangement that does not mirror the picture at a national level. But I'll come back to that because Gauteng, the ANC in Gauteng has always behaved differently to how the ANC behaves nationally. And I think it's always like it's a window of opportunity into things to come. And it's about the shifts of power. If you think carefully back to 2016, when the ANC lost the majority in all the three metros, by the way, and then they tied up with the AIC in Ekurhuleni. The ANC in Gauteng had actually barred President Zuma from campaigning in Gauteng, and they did not want him there. And I am reading the situation with Gauteng today in a lens that is about 2027 in terms of the ANC's own internal battles. And I think that the ANC is telling us, one, that they reject the bullying tactics of the DA, because the DA was supposedly asking for much more than the ANC in Gauteng thought that they were due to get in terms of the number of seats in the cabinet. And I think that what the ANC is going to probably coalesce around in Gauteng are these, anti-DA sentiments within COSATU, within the SACP, and we are going to see something morph into a very serious and vibrant campaign in terms of who takes power after Cyril. And I have put my head on the block recently to say, I don't see anybody who's a contender to Paul Mashatile in this moment. There may well be something that develops as time goes by. But I think, Michael, in terms of, what we call a government of national unity, and this is where probably I fled with MK, a party, and I just call it a grand coalition, because a government of national unity in anywhere in the world is an end point of negotiations to mediate a political crisis or social crisis that is in that country or that is in that society. Here we don't have a political crisis. The ANC has just lost power. And I think people have been bought into Ramaphosa's idea to say, well, let's form a government of national unity where we invite everybody, those who choose not to participate, it is on their own accord rather than you know, us not inviting them in. And therefore, your MK, your EFF could have been part of that, but it was quite clear that the DA was not interested in participating in an arrangement that involves the EFF. But I do think that what we are confronted with, as you have been saying, it's only the statement of intent that is out there. There's no coalition agreement. And it doesn't seem like there's an appetite to develop a coalition agreement because there are 10 parties to this. And what I've been getting is that these parties have never sat down, besides the cabinet lekgotla that took place before the opening of parliament. These parties have never sat down as political parties to say what brings us together. So the ANC is always almost one-on-one offlining with the other parties. And I think that's the weakness of this arrangement. So you've got too many players and you've got to keep all of them as happy as possible. But at the same time, you do not have a sense of them meeting to craft a political agreement, which would then live in as a coalition agreement. And I think we need to pressure the parties to graduate from the statement of intent, because the statement of intent is a political document that was crafted largely by the ANC and the DA, and everybody else has sort of signed up to this. But you do need to get to a sense where there is a coalition agreement. And I think what is the weakness of this arrangement now is the absence of that center that holds for all political parties, and the sense that, you know, this so-called consensus that must guide seems to depend on the ANC and the DA. And I think that is an inherent risk. It's an inherent risk because I think the DA itself is trying to find its feet. They are not too sure how to behave. It's the first time that the DA has gone into a coalition arrangement as a significant junior partner. And I think we need to look at that carefully. And then, of course, there are internal, as I said, with the ANC 2027, their national conference, with the DA, I think it's 2026, their national congress. And we need to see how these, choose leaders or affirm leaders. John Steenhuisen might get another term. Cyril is definitely not coming back. It might matter for the DA who replaces Cyril in terms of them, staying on and staying put in terms of this government of national unity, quote unquote. And I think that it's going to be very interesting over the next year or two to see how the DA positions itself, because I feel that they've suddenly lost their voice. They've lost their ability to set their agenda. As you would know, Michael, General Steenhuisen does an alternative SONA a day before SONA. There was nothing of the sort before the opening of parliament, and that's because of the times that we are in. So they are very muted, and it's going to be interesting how they unmute themselves in the next years to follow. And unmuting themselves may well mean them withdrawing from the government of national unity and repositioning themselves as the official opposition in parliament, so that they remain relevant with their constituency parts. But I think that where we are in terms of KwaZulu-Natal, KwaZulu-Natal was a different case. MK has 45% of the vote there. And it was probably easier for the GNU partners to find one another so that they fend off the threat of MK forming a government, which they could have if they had led any of the partners like the IFP. But I think KZN is, of course, a mirror of what is happening nationally. Gauteng has decided on its own script, but as I say, I think it's for internal ANC politics, and they are probably showing us what is to come towards the 2027 conference. And I don't think the DA has much sway in Gauteng to actually force Panyaza to formulate a government of provincial unity. What I do want to say, though, Michael, as a point of caution, is that cascading this down to local municipalities might actually be a very, it's doable, but I don't think it's advisable, because you want to get to a point where there is some level of stability in these municipalities. For example, in Tshwane, I think there's some sense of stabilization. But if you look at the city of Joburg, I think, there are some ructions there. The mayor is probably going to leave post next month. But we must remember that there are over 40 municipalities that are under coalitions. And the only points of focus tend to be the ones that make it into the news. The reality is that most or the majority of the municipalities under coalitions are actually working. They are stable. They are managing their business quite well. And so when we think of cascading down the government of national unity arrangement, we must also remember that it may well cause instability in municipalities that are actually quite functional and stable under coalitions, and very different permutations of coalition agreements that are actually out there. And so for me, the other question that we have not properly discussed is what is desirable. Should national bosses, be negotiating local arrangements, or should the caucuses in those municipalities, in those councils, be allowed to, in their own way, understanding their context and lived circumstances, negotiate, and therefore someday you may well find a situation where the IFP is in an agreement with the ANC or without the DA. I mean, you go to Northern Cape, for example. I mean, we talk about Gauteng and KZN. The ANC in Northern Cape decides to get into an arrangement with FF Plus and not the DA. So those are the kinds of things that we've got to then say, are people going rogue, or should we be seeing this as a new dispensation where, context must matter, and there must be some, room given to local authorities to cement and arrange their own coalition agreements, particularly as we go to 2026 local government elections. And I think that we will see many more municipalities becoming coalitions, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal. Thanks, Mike.
Sorry. Thank you, Lukhona. So I was saying you've unpacked the complexities very, very well. And I think it also helps to show how dynamic this process is going to be. We are, as I said at the beginning, after all, only 1 month into the experience of the GNU. There is no doubt a lot of things that can go wrong, a lot of things to be ironed out, a lot of mistakes to be made. And the inconsistencies across the country in the different provincial setups and local government setups will no doubt have some sort of an impact on the national setup as well. I've noticed that some questions are coming into the chat box now. Thank you very much. And please do feel free to go ahead putting those in. I'm going to hold off dealing with the questions until we have heard from our final speaker. But I would ask all the speakers just to have a look in the chat box themselves. Some of the questions are directed at particular individuals, and some of them are more general. And once we've heard from Dr. Conrad Bosire, then we will start to deal with those questions. So this brings me to introduce to you our last speaker. Once again, at the comparative level, we thought it would be very useful to get some insight from another country which has gone through the experience of government of national unity. And of course, Kenya experienced that after the unfortunate violence and disruption that accompanied the elections in that country back in 2008. And I think for about a 5-year period after that, there was a government of national unity. Dr. Conrad Bosire is going to speak to us on that topic. And I'm just going to introduce him specifically because as a guest from outside the country, he may not be familiar to many of us. So Conrad is, has a specific expertise in multi-level systems of governance, including federalism, devolution, and decentralization, and has also worked in the area of judicial reform and justice systems. I mentioned earlier that he was Chief of Staff in the Kenyan Judiciary. That was from 2018 to 2021, and also acting Executive Director of the National Council on the Administration of Justice in Kenya. At the moment, he is an independent consultant and an adjunct lecturer at Strathmore Law School in Nairobi. And I also see that Conrad has his PhD from the University of the Western Cape, so no doubt he is familiar to many of you who are in on this webinar. So Dr. Conrad Bosire, if you would like to switch on your video and unmute yourself and share your presentation with us. Thank you.
I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, we can.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mike, and everyone. It's really a pleasure to join you today and to listen to all these interesting discussions on the government of national unity and how it's going on 1 month on, and to reflect a bit on the Kenyan perspectives. I wouldn't take a lot of time discussing on this. I'll just like maybe to present on 3 main issues. First is just the general Kenyan context, and especially the distinguishing factors from the context in South Africa. And just to mention that I was a PhD student at DOI under Professors Nico Steydler and Jaap de Visser. So I'm kind of familiar with the context in South Africa, but also I keep learning, especially from the presentations which we've just had. So I'll give the Kenyan context and then very brief history of the coalitions. We've had the main one in 2008, which you've referred to, but we also have some semblance of coalitions in 2017 and currently. And then what would be the broad trends in Kenyan coalitions? So maybe from the Kenyan context, and as alluded to in the paper prepared by the DOI and shared with us, is that the GNUs or coalitions in Kenya are basically a political crisis management tool. We think about them when we are at the deep end of conflict, political conflict, and we want to stabilize government and get back to ordinary governance processes, and therefore we try to bring together the different players. The other thing is that as we got into the practice of these coalitions, and we're going to see the factors that led to this, is that we have prepared a legal framework for registration of pre-election coalitions in a bid to manage the way in which coalition politics are happening. But the implementation of that law and its effectiveness is a different story. But we have a legal framework as a response to this, trying to bring discipline and all that. The other major difference is that coalitions in Kenya are formed in the context of the first past the post electoral system, where we directly elect the president. It's not what we have in South Africa, where after elections that Parliament comes together to elect the president and the speaker and all the other leaders. So the context here is different. We actually have a directly elected president in office who then tries to form a government of national unity or a coalition. And now we are calling it broad-based government after the recent protests. We are not very clear on the terminologies, as is the case in South Africa. And then the other issue is that compared to South African political parties generally, the political parties in Kenya here have no clear political party ideology. And the impact of this is that it makes the coalitions or the management of the coalitions very politically fluid. It's a politically fluid affair because one day we have this party, the next the parties have merged, and there is no clear demarcation of what the parties stand for. And in that case, sometimes it affects the management and the personalities within those parties. The presidential elections in Kenya, as you may know, are hotly contested between the opposition and the incumbent. Actually, the president is not sure sometimes of retaining the seat, and the opposition sometimes is sure of getting the victory. So that creates very high stakes in the process, and that is what we saw in 2007, and basically the elections. Just that in 2007. It went out of control for various factors leading to that conflict. And then in Kenya, there is one other distinguishing feature in these coalitions, is that these coalitions, once they get into office, there's a movement always to transform these coalitions into single political parties, partly because of that fluid political ideologies and not well-grounded political parties. They simply try to transform themselves into a single political party, dissolve the other smaller parties, join one new party or the main party, and then as basically as a political strategy for the next campaign. And then we have where in South Africa you see some orderly way in which these coalitions are coming up, the statement of intent or the coalition agreement and the requirements to publish them and accountability and all that. Here, there are no clear principles for managing the coalitions, maybe except for the 2008 to 2013. I heard the last speaker, Lukhona, mentioned that it was entrenched in the constitution. Also for us, the 2008 had to be accommodated in the constitution, and we had actually a specific law to govern the coalition, which lapsed in the next general election. And as I said, basically, the presidential elections are an ethnic political duel between the 5 largest ethnic communities. And if you look at the last 5 presidents, they have actually come from these 5 communities, and always the major contenders for the presidency are drawn from the big 5 ethnic communities in Kenya because of that ethnicized environment. We have the Luya, Kikuyu, Kalenjin, Luo, and Kamba. They are the ones who produce, should I say, serious contenders or major contenders for the presidential election. We have seen something different recently, and the paper that was shared with us spoke about it. The Generation Z protests, they have come up saying that they are tribeless, they are leaderless, they are fearless, and they are trying to change the context. And what has happened recently, and the paper alluded to that, is that the current president, President Ruto, a few weeks ago dissolved his entire cabinet and then formed a new cabinet incorporating members of the opposition coalition, one party in the opposition coalition, Raila Odinga's party. 4 luminaries were appointed into cabinet positions, and for us, they have to go through parliamentary vetting and approval, and that is the process that is just about to start. But the question which everyone is asking, you know, the Gen Z came up and brought up a lot of governance issues that needs to be looked at, but the response is the old political solution to these cases, which is trying to do a coalition between the old parties and as a response to the protests that we saw from the youngsters. And the question is this an old political solution to a new political challenge? And then is there an understanding of this changing political dynamic? So maybe before the 2008, just to mention, is that we did not have requirements. Actually, what brought this, of course, in 2008 was the need for national unity. And before that, the second president, the one who oversaw the introduction of multi-party politics in 1992, actually became president with 36% of the national vote. He was a minority president, but by then we just gave the presidency was won by the one who had the most votes, regardless of the margin of the vote. In 2010, the 2010 constitution, which was introduced at the end of the 2008-2013 coalition, there's a constitutional requirement that for you to be president, you must have 50% of the votes plus one vote. So at least more than a half of the vote cast, and you must win at least 25% votes in at least 24 of the 47 county governments in Kenya. In Kenya, the country is divided into 47 county governments, and you must win at least 25% of the vote in 24 of those counties for you to qualify as a president. So the 2008 to 2013 Grand Coalition Agreement was, of course, as you had after the disputed presidential election, and the ODM party, the opposition, refused to challenge election in the courts, alleging that the courts were compromised and there was no guarantee of a fair process. And of course, the AU brokered peace deal through Kofi Annan, the late, resulted in the Grand Coalition government. And this was reduced into a law that lapsed in the 2013 election. And there was a constitutional amendment that accommodated the structure. Basically, the opposition candidate became the prime minister, and a super large cabinet of 40 was formed that stayed on during that period of the Grand Coalition government. And basically, the agreement also included overhauling of the constitution, and then the adoption of the new constitution in August 2010. I was told to briefly reflect on the coalition management during this period. As I've mentioned, it's something that was entrenched in the law and specifically in the constitution. So therefore, the leaders actually had to work together based on that broad framework. Their primary objective or goal that was set from the negotiations was to deliver a new constitution for the country. And if you are to measure that yardstick, then the coalition actually succeeded in birthing a new constitutional dispensation with a new constitution in August of 2010. And basically, if you look at how the coalition was managed and all that, of course, these are political personalities who had just emerged from a very fierce presidential election. There was also the International Criminal Court, which came in, and there was an indictment of 6 individuals, including the candidates who became president and deputy president in the 2013 election. So while they campaigned together for the new constitution, there were a lot of governance challenges. It was actually very chaotic, and it's a marriage that was of convenience that brought them together up to the 2013 dispensation. And actually leading towards the election, the incumbent president and the prime minister went into opposite parties for purposes of campaigning and support of candidates, and which led then to the 2013 Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto government. In the first term of the Uhuru and the Ruto government from 2013 to 2017, the coalition held together, and it's during this period, because of the power of incumbency and influence, somehow they got the ICC case dropped, and during this first term, we did not witness any semblance of a coalition. But if you recall, it is during the 2017 election that the Supreme Court nullified the presidential election and called for a repeat election, which was held, and then Uhuru's victory with Ruto was confirmed. But early in the second term of the Uhuru government, the elections were in 2017, but in March 2018, we saw what was widely called as the Uhuru-Raila handshake. If you recall well, the former president and the current president had fallen out as partners in a government, and Uhuru reached out to the opposition, and we had what was widely called the Uhuru-Raila handshake. And this basically, if you look at it, it was meant to tame the opposition, bring it in, not to disrupt government in its programs and all that, and also to create a countervailing force against the deputy president, whom had fallen out with the president at that time. But what is peculiar with this period is that there were no formally declared principles of the handshake. They surprised Kenyans one morning outside the office of the president with there was no portfolio sharing or allocation, as was in 2008, or the recent one in 2024, when 4 members of the opposition were appointed into the cabinet. But most significantly, this political agreement or handshake led to one of the most extensive constitutional amendment proposals called Building Bridges Initiative, that was actually going to change the character of the constitution. However, the courts in Kenya are very strong, and they kept a check on that, and they actually put a stop to this Building Bridges Initiative that was going to introduce extensive changes to government, including reverting to what we could call a parliamentary system of government. And this Building Bridges Initiative and the handshake laid the basis for the 2022 political coalition, one with the former president and Raila under Azimio, and of course, Ruto under the Kenya Kwanza coalition. In the 2022 elections, President Ruto won the election with a margin of around 200,000 votes against Raila Odinga, who was President Uhuru's preferred candidate. The victory was affirmed by the Supreme Court. And things have been largely stable, but in 2023, a year after the election, there were opposition protests in most of 2023, basically led by the Raila party. But then very recently, 2-3 months ago, we have had protests from the Generation Z for the last 3 months now. And some of these demands, it started with the finance bill, which was proposed in Parliament for 2024-2025. There was protests about excessive taxation and revenue-raising measures and all that, which led to, of course, Parliament, because it's in the control of the president's party, was able to rail through this bill amidst public protests. But the president, after all these protests, made a decision to drop the bill. And actually, Parliament recently ratified the decision to drop the bill. Soon after, with the persistent process, the president dissolved the cabinet. And then now spoke about forming a broad-based government for national unity, again with no clear principles, but it was clear that the parties, the opposition and all these were negotiating. The thing is that even when these politicians were doing all this, the Gen Z, who say they are partyless, were not part of these formal discussions. Of course, the president in the media tried to involve the youngsters and all this, but the decisions which were made, including the new cabinet, is based on the old political solution of parties talking. So some of the things, as I said earlier, we were asking that, so the youngsters go to the streets on governance issues, and then the solution is the old political parties making a pact and all this. Of course, Raila's party, ODM, is in a coalition which, as I said, called Azimio, whose members joined the party. There's other smaller parties within Azimio, NAK Kenya, Wiper Party. They rejected unilaterally the offer to join government. And as I've said, 4 members from ODM joined. The ODM party in its official communication has disowned the nominees, but the party leaders acquiesced to this structure, which is seen as a response to the Gen Z protests. The point here is that, as you can see, the fluidity of political parties, personalities, and all that. And because at any one time, a president will have very strong opposition, either from the political parties or, as you have witnessed, from the public generally, as represented by the Gen Z protests that we had here. And basically that keeps the government politically at check. And maybe it's the reason why, actually it's the reason why the President Ruto made this move to accommodate. But again, let me call it a very unprincipled process of bringing these parties and coalitions together. So the presidential vote margin, which was introduced in 2010, that requires the president to have 50% plus 1 of the votes, as well as winning in a number of counties, had the impetus of creating pre-election ethnic-based political coalitions around these major communities and counter coalitions, pitting the big 5 communities. This has happened in 2013, it happened in 2017, and it happened in 2022. There's no clear principles and manner of management of the pre-election coalition pacts. And you can see that the evidence is mid-election cycle party defections. There's buying of independent candidates and putting together in the ruling coalition so that your agenda passes through the legislature. And we have a very strict political parties law, but it means nothing in practice, in my view. There's weak enforcement and ineffective party disciplinary structures. For instance, as I've said, the ODM party says that the persons who are appointed as ministers did not have the blessing of the party. So you can see how weak the political party system is. So in 2022, just before the last election, they passed the Political Parties Amendment Act, which recognized political coalitions as a political party for purposes of elections. And they require that any coalition that is going to be formed to front a presidential candidate to be registered as a political party sometime before the election. And the 2 coalitions which went into election last time, Kenya Kwanza and Azimio, they actually were registered as political parties under this Amendment Act of 2022. There's all conditions about parties, lists, symbols, and all that. There's strict provisions on defections and general party control, but as I've said, all these are usually very, they are not enforced in practice, because you find that the actions taken sometimes breach the law, but there's no consequence. And it's because of the fluidity of political formations in this country, for instance, compared to what obtains in South Africa. So in conclusion, the lit consensus in 2010, I didn't mention this, but it's important to mention it. all through the constitution making process, which took like 20 years. Each constitutional draft that was developed called for or proposed a parliamentary system of government. But in 2010, a political elite pact, politicians met. You remember this is the time when we had the Grand Coalition, which produced the constitution. They surprisingly agreed to retain the presidential system of government. But each draft and public views had called for a parliamentary system of government. And you can see even the coalition making and all that is trying to mimic the parliamentary systems of government. And constitutional amendment somehow finds its way to coalition agenda every time. And in my view, this signals political discontent with the current structure, which they agreed to in 2010. But the process of amending the constitution and heralding a new structure is quite tenuous, and even as recent as the other day, the coalition leaders, if I can call them that, Raila specifically is now again calling for constitutional amendments and all that. But overall is that while this culture of coalition is taking root and consistent in Kenya, I start from where I state what I said at the beginning, is that it is conflict resolution, it's crisis management. And the political culture, if you look at it holistically, is yet to align with the non-coalition management principles that we see to some extent in South Africa and the other systems which Professor Jaap alluded to earlier. Thank you very much.
Thank you indeed, Conrad. Thank you very much for that. Very interesting exposition. I noticed you mentioned at one point that when the GNU was formed, I think it was the 2008 one, there had to be a cabinet of 40 people. It's comforting to know in a way that our cabinet of 32 is not the largest one that has been brought about as a result of a GNU. And of course, it gives a new meaning to what Joleen talked about earlier as an elite-driven pact. So we've come to the end of the presentations, and I'd like to thank all of the speakers for their inputs, and in particular also for keeping to time, which means that we have at least 45 minutes or so for discussions and questions and comments from all of you as participants. And I'm going to start with that by going to the chat box and just looking at some of the questions that have been posed there already. There are a couple, as I mentioned earlier, that have been posed to particular speakers, and I think it makes sense to deal with those straight away and then move to the more general questions. So, Lukhona, there's one question with your name on it, where the question is asking, looking at the noise from alliance partners and some within the ANC around the decision to form a GNU, it looks at this, there wasn't a full mandate from within the ANC. It wasn't even discussed at its most recent conference. Do you think this could result in Ramaphosa being recalled? Do you want to handle that one, Lukhona?
Yes, Michael. Look, the mandate for negotiating a coalition was self-fulfilling. The ANC had 40% of the vote, and something needed to be done. And of course, we know that in the lead up to the elections, the DA had been priming an ANC-EFF coalition as a doomsday coalition. The markets bought into this and they priced it in. And I think that the ANC was actually left without a choice but to look for friends in the DA, but sanitize that decision by inviting as wide an audience of political parties as possible, as they've done now. So I don't think that there's any threat for Ramaphosa to be recalled. I know that a lot of people are worried about the National General Council of the ANC next year. The ANC has not had an NGC since 2010. So I'm not even sure why we think that it will probably happen next year. The constitution of the ANC is very clear about the mandate and the standing of the National General Council. It has no powers to recall leadership, because remember, if you recall leadership, then you would have to replace leadership. And I think that, as I said to one journalist actually last week, I actually think this is the end of the road for the tripartite alliance of the ANC, COSATU, and the SACP, because the ANC has had to now find a real tripartite or quadruple alliance in the political parties that are helping them to govern. The SACP and COSATU bring no political power to the ANC and for the ANC. It's the other parties that are keeping the ANC in government. And I think that is the new alliance that we must now focus on. And that is the new alliance that's going to matter for Ramaphosa. And I think to a large degree, it's the alliance that may even want to influence the succession within the ANC in terms of who comes after Ramaphosa, so that this alliance of political parties can continue to have sustenance and government, and probably be one person who comes after Ramaphosa who will not threaten his power as the sitting president. And it may well be, in fact, I think that this a coalition is licensed for Ramaphosa to potentially finish his second term, and it will be the first president of the ANC who actually gets to finish a second term, because Mbeki didn't and Zuma didn't, and whether the person who succeeds Ramaphosa as ANC president will matter for that to be the case, because they will also be gaming whether or not the ANC will rebound in 2029, or the ANC will, and they would have the benefit of the local government elections. And if the ANC continues to be a dwindling party, then probably they would then ask Ramaphosa to leave so that they become president, at least in a sure way. But they would need the votes of the other political parties when being voted into power in the National Assembly. So I think it's an interesting period where the ANC finds itself. There are a lot of things that we need to monitor in order for us to be able to have productive conversations about what the future holds for Ramaphosa. But I'm already trying to develop the indicators of how we monitor that conversation. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. Another question that was addressed partly to you, but I'm actually going to ask Nonhlanhla to deal with it, and maybe also Jaap, is the one around the way the political negotiations were handled. And the questioner says, for example, the situation in Gauteng was disappointing. Was the DA pushing too hard and not prepared to compromise, or was the ANC leadership in the province being too arrogant? It raises this question that people have spoken about, the possible need for a legislative or a regulatory framework of some sort to guide the formation of coalitions, which we don't have after all. I mean, we just left this up to the political leadership of the different parties to get into the proverbial smoke-filled rooms and thrash it out. So, Nonhlanhla, do you have some thoughts on that aspect?
Thank you very much. You know, I actually thought that Lukhona would have a view more than myself in this particular question, because my view will very much be a personal one and not so much an academic view, if one would say. But for me, I think what happened, I think Reddy is the one that asked the question. I think the Gauteng Kohut or Panyaza is what actually happened in Gauteng, which I do strongly believe that his views are very much perhaps different from, and I don't want to say this, the ANC views, but very much from Ramaphosa's view of what government should look like under Ramaphosa. So I really do not have much to say on that, but to say that I think it was very much a political move where Panyaza just does not agree with national. But I think also what I was anticipating to see was whether the national government or the national structure of the party would actually call him in a way to force him to tell the lie. And I think I want to be as ambitious as Lukhona and say that Ramaphosa might not be facing the heat in one way or might be protected from being recalled. But I do believe from what Panyaza has shown us that there is certainly a lot of heat within the party itself. It might not manifest as quick as we think, but I really do believe that there is much that could come, and that Panyaza perhaps is what is showing us what is really being cooked currently within the party structures themselves. Yeah, but that is really my view on that matter. If you can allow me just 2 seconds, there was just one question from Smith, I believe, Sandra Smith, who asked that what happens to oversight generally when we've got now such an issue. If I can just touch on that so that I can then exit before I forget this. I think we should not be too scared, Sandra, when it comes to oversight, political or what other oversight, because what we also saw cooking is that they've got the spaza shop, in a way that I would put, with those that have been left out in what has been today termed the coalition light. Those that have been left out are seeming to form their own caucus, where they might then become what we need to have an oversight in this GNU that we've seen today. Thank you.
Thanks, Nonhlanhla. Jaap, do you want to come in on this question of the need for some sort of regulatory framework around the formation of coalitions?
Yes, thanks, Mike. So I'm not in favor of a regulatory framework for coalitions. I don't think that's a good idea. I think we need to learn from what has been happening over the past couple of years and past couple of months, barring one regulatory intervention that I do think we need to seriously consider, which is the 14-day period. I think it's too short. And it may seem like an innocuous detail, but I think it does really put the cart before the horse in a way that is, I think, unhealthy for the development of healthy coalition building practices. Because there's two elements to the question. The one is how the GNU was formed. Now, and it goes back to the question of Joleen, of how do we make coalition building more values-based, more coherent, and less elite? Now, that's not going to happen automatically. It's not going to happen because we say so or because we want to. We need to work towards government, political parties, the political party system, or the political system at a national government level needs to come up with certain conventions and protocols, not laid down in law, but how do we do this? Because what happened now is there was an electoral outcome, and essentially Cyril Ramaphosa pulled a crisis ticket and built on that a government of national unity. Brilliant political strategy, as Joleen also pointed out. And it worked well for now. But it cannot work every time, because we cannot cry crisis every 5 years and think there's going to be another government of national unity. There must be some sort of normalization of coalition building. And I would then want to ask the question, what is the role of Parliament? Because Parliament elects the president, of course, because our presidential system is somewhere in between Kenya and the UK. We don't have a fully fledged parliamentary system, but we don't have a fully fledged presidential system either. We have something in between. Parliament elects the president, but the president then becomes a very powerful executive leader. But what is the role of Parliament in the formation of a coalition? Why can Parliament not nominate someone or a team or some sort of structure that is mandated by Parliament to look at feasible coalition options? What about that kind of solution? Now, currently, that's not possible within the 14-day time period. Simply impossible for that to be done. So I do want us to start thinking about the next election, because the next election may very well not again produce an outright win. And is it going to be a type of Mexican standoff where everyone sort of stares at each other and what do we do? And somebody pulls a brilliant political maneuver out of the hat? Or are we going to have some sort of predictable methods, systems, conventions of building coalitions, which we don't need to put in law, but we can agree on and build over time. The second element to the question is, what about Gauteng? Now, I'm in two minds on this, and I think Lukhona, I read in his input also that he's in two minds on this. On the one hand, these umbrella coalition agreements, also the one that we have now, the GNU, provides additional stability across the system of government, because if a political party in a province or in a municipality pulls out of a GNU-aligned coalition, there's more at stake than just your own municipality or your own province. So it provides additional stability, and we've seen that in practice, that those umbrella coalition agreements, even other than the GNU, they have provided additional stability to coalitions at subnational level. On the other hand, it cannot always work, and we've seen it now. Gauteng writes its own script, as Lukhona indicated. And there are municipalities that have other coalitions that are fairly stable. So we have a multi-level government system. We have a decentralized system. And that must mean that it's okay that there are different coalitions at different levels of government. We have to accept that. There cannot be one national coalition agreement that covers the entire country wherever there is a need for a coalition. So we have to accept that there's going to be outliers. And whatever one makes of the Gauteng dynamics, and Lukhona is best placed to analyze them and provide us insight into that, it's that provincial democracy that then dictates how coalitions are formed in that province. And I don't think it's for us feasible to expect that a national GNU or a national coalition is going to be the blanket that covers all coalitions across the country. So I think we need to work with that reality. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. There's a set of inputs, questions, and comments around the idea of the national dialogue. Any comments on President's invitation when he delivered his opening of Parliament speech for the nation to work together to hold national dialogue to discuss the critical challenges facing the nation, etc., etc. It's pointed out by one of the guests that this is contained within the statement of intent as well. I'm going to ask Joleen to comment on this. What would be the nature of this national dialogue? As you referred to in your input, there was no referendum or anything behind the current GNU. Does this envisage national dialogue offer some sort of way of rooting it in more popularly, taking it away from just the elites? Is it feasible?
I think that is the big question. Is it feasible? Because ultimately you are bringing in quite a number of role players. And, I think if we start looking at the basis of a national dialogue, I would venture to say from a political dynamics perspective that inevitably it could again be, your political elites trying to get some sort of buy-in from broader civil society, from the public, from trade unions, from key critical role players that will need to hop on board and kind of give their buy-in and their support to the policy direction in which this GNU wants to take the country. So I think just to link on to what Jaap was talking about a little bit earlier on around are we going to regulate coalitions? And again, this form of dialogue becomes important because it speaks to norms and norm building, and what norms is going to guide how we are going to do the business of governance in this collaboration or in this partnership that we find ourselves in. And I think for me, that was quite interesting from the Kenyan experience was my takeaway, at least, was that this kind of norm building, this values-based type of approach to coalitions only came through as Kenyan political parties and political actors did coalitions. They had to experience coalitions and experience the ups and downs. And it was interesting to note Gen Z being portrayed as non-partisan or apolitical. So, you know, I think we are, as was rightly mentioned, 1 month in, with a national dialogue. We need to see what type of norms are being built, what type of policy propositions are being made. But I do feel, and I know I'm harboring on the point, I do feel it is more a form of trying to get some buy-in from key civil society role players, key political role players, private sector, business, that all need to come on board to find some sort of sustainability in the policy direction the country might be going.
Thank you. There certainly doesn't seem to have been any major or popular pushback against the formation of the GNU. It seems that, from my reading anyway, most sectors have either welcomed it or at least accepted it. It's not that there's a groundswell of opinion that is definitively against it. So perhaps there is scope for some sort of a national dialogue to take it forward. There are two questions, at least, that sort of look at worst case scenario, in other words, collapse. One which poses the question about whether the GNU can survive the DA's determination to introduce bills aimed at fixing the anti-corruption capacity of government. And then earlier on, the blunt question was posed, what happens if the GNU collapses? So perhaps we can combine those two questions, and I'm going to leave it to any of the speakers to respond. Anti-corruption moves could be a sort of breaking point. There are many other potential breaking points as well. What happens if it collapses? What are the chances of the GNU lasting for the term, for the 5-year term? Anybody want to take that up?
I'll go first, Mike, and then maybe the other colleagues can go. Look, I don't think that things will collapse necessarily on the DA part. I think the DA is going to try and be very measured and circumspect in how it proceeds. And we've started hearing, you know, how they message around Pala, for example. What happens if Pala comes back to Parliament? And we know that the EFF and the ATM are in the courts trying to see how they can revive the matter to say that Parliament was amiss to vote down the report of the Ngcobo panel. So around those issues where their moral standing is going to be questioned, I think they are beginning to signal that they are friends of the ANC and they want to make this government work as much as possible. But as we listen to the president's opening of Parliament address, you know, where he was quite clear about the difficulties around the national health insurance, for example, because the DA had indicated that they would go to the courts to review aspects of the National Health Insurance Act. And I think it's going to be interesting to see whether or not they remain steadfast in pursuing those issues, in ensuring that they hold their party line. Because remember, they've got constituencies that must not be forgotten, or at least must not be the sacrificial lamb at the altar of the government of national unity. But I don't think there is material threat in terms of, I mean, if you were to think about what are the anti-corruption issues by law that the DA should bring on board, and I've been quite clear that we've got enough architecture in our institutions that safeguard against corruption, but we just need to make sure that those institutions work and they are bolstered up. I think, you know, you need a national prosecuting authority that is fit for purpose. You need the independence of the Hawks, the SIU, the Auditor General, Scopa in Parliament, and many other bodies to be efficient in what they are tasked and charged with doing. I don't think that we need any additional, I mean, as the Zondo Commission would have as the Zondo Commission would have proposed, an anti-corruption council, for example. I don't think you need those things. I think we've got enough institutions and we need to staff them properly, because if we create more institutions, what we do is we starve the staffing of the currently existing institutions, and therefore they lack capacity to execute on their mandates properly. But I think for the DA, it was a big bullet to bite, and I think they will want to do right by their commitment to the ANC for some time. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. Any of the other speakers like to take up this question? What happens if it collapses?
If I may, Mike, I just wanted to point out as well, that we are also very, very focused on what are the inter-party dynamics, So we look at the dynamics between the ANC and the DA, for example, around the national health insurance and around those key critical questions. But I think there's also an added layer in there, and that is the intra-party dynamic. That will also need to be managed within this broader GNU context. So on the one hand, you've got to manage the different political players, but at the same time, you will also need to manage whatever patronage systems exist within the party system, or within the political party itself. And just as a disclaimer, I know very often when we speak patronage, the assumption immediately goes ANC, and that is not necessarily the case. All political parties within the GNU formation have systems of patronage attached to them. And it's those intra-party dynamics coupled with the inter-party dynamics that can actually also facilitate a broader collapse.
Yeah, you also wanted to say something on this?
Yeah, just maybe something related to this, but not exactly on topic, but picking up on the question that Professor Xavier Philippe asks in the chat about the nature of the regime, how that plays a role in coalition building, and also the point that I think Pretorius makes on the building of a coalition shortly after the election. So I think we need to acknowledge that we cannot regulate political behavior, we cannot regulate coalitions. But the regime that we have in our constitution is not right for coalitions. We need to acknowledge that the constitution is imperfect. Because what the constitution does is, on the one hand, impose an electoral system, namely proportional representation, that is very likely to produce a scrambled egg, as we've now seen for the first time in national elections. It's very likely because that's what the PR system does. It's designed to do that. Produces a scrambled egg. Then what the constitution furthermore does, contradictory to that, says within 2 weeks, you must, out of that scrambled egg, produce a president. You only have 2 weeks for that. And furthermore, once the president has been elected after those 2 weeks, the government ceases to exist. There's no longer a government, there's now a new government. So it basically, on the one hand, says you may very likely have a scrambled egg outcome, but you also only have 2 weeks to form a government. So that combination is not right for coalitions. So we need to revisit the constitution in that respect. For example, why can the incumbent government not stay in place until a new government has been formed completely on the basis of a coalition agreement? Currently, the constitution doesn't really allow for that. So while I do not think that we need to regulate ways and means of building and sustaining coalitions by law, we do need to look carefully at our constitutional regime and to what extent that puts us in a position that makes coalition formation very difficult and very stressful. And it's only now through the, I suppose, the political brilliance of Cyril Ramaphosa and the ANC that we have a government of national unity that, on the basis of a crisis ticket, was formed and seems to be well on its way for now. We cannot pull the same rabbit out of the hat with every election. So I do think there's work to be done on that front. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. Just sort of picking up a little bit on what you've said, Jaap, and some of the other speakers as well, there's been a slight allusion to the electoral system that we have brings about this sort of result almost by intention. Other commentators have said this is probably the last election, or these were probably the last elections which we will have under the pure PR system. And we know that the amendments to the Electoral Act that were passed a couple of years ago call for the formation of yet another commission of inquiry to search for a new electoral system. Whether that'll be achieved before 2029, I don't know. But does that hold the promise of a smoother coalition process in future elections, electoral reform, moving away from pure PR? Is that something we should be contemplating?
If I may, I see there's a deafening silence on a very difficult question. And we have to bear in mind the question of electoral reform is not a new debate in the country. You know, and I think for me, the most critical element around electoral reform, apologies, my dog also has an opinion on this, it seems, you know, is to the extent that you can actually link your political elite more to a public mandate. So for me, the bigger question is, how do you ensure accountability or more accountability powers in the public hand than what you currently do or find in a PR system, if that makes any sense. So, you know, if we look at the local government system, you've got the ward level along with, you know, kind of you're trying to mirror it with your PR system. Will something like that be doable at a national level where you can create broader public accountability of politicians and political elites? Which I think may then start laying the ground for a very different construction of GNUs and a very different process that's followed if political elites are more directly held accountable by the public than what they currently are.
Thank you. Yeah, you also wanted to respond to this one?
No, I think Joleen has covered it excellently. Thanks so much.
Okay. Thank you. I'm just checking the chat box to see if there's anything that we have not addressed one way or the other. I think we've covered pretty much all of the points made in the chat box. If anybody feels that we haven't, please do reiterate your point.
Could I make a quick point, Mike?
Yeah.
Just to maybe just bring the attention to the one effort that government is undertaking to, let's say, regulate coalitions, which is the so-called coalitions bill that is being mooted by the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs. One element of that bill is actually to impose governments of national unity at every local government where there is no outright majority. So we seem to be quite sort of into this government of national unity conundrum or way of thinking, because what the bill, one of the many things, a few things that the bill says is that whenever there is no outright majority in a municipal council, that the MEC in that province must change that municipality, if it is not an executive committee, into an executive committee system. In other words, what that means is that the executive of that municipality will then, by law, be comprised of all major political parties on the council through a strict formula of proportionality. which is basically government of national unity, not government of national unity light, but government of national unity proper, where every major political party that meets the threshold would be represented on the municipal executive. So yeah, I just wanted to alert the meeting to that proposal, and ask the question, will that work? Is that a solution for the coalition difficulties that we've seen at local government level? Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you. Nonhlanhla, please go ahead.
2 seconds. I think because of the intervention now, or the point that has just been raised by the professor, I saw in the comments Nyembezi, I think, posted something, and I really echo his sentiments, and I think it goes very well with what Prof. Jaap has said. That I think one of the things with this GNU is that perhaps we are missing the point, certainly as Nyembezi put it, that this is more about the people and not so much the political parties. The voting patterns that we've seen with this last election. And I think perhaps that's what can guide even any policy that might come from this GNU. It's not so much about the parties themselves, but what the people want to see, where the whole issue of one party holding a massive partner has really not gone down the patterns of people in a good way. So I think really we need to remember that moving forward. The elections themselves, I think the parties are missing the point. It's really not so much about them. It's the people trying to say something, and somewhere we're just not listening, or the parties themselves have. But thank you.
Thanks, Nonhlanhla. Conrad, could I ask you, perhaps for, once again, on the comparative level, how do you see the prospects for the broad-based government in Kenya at the moment? Is it going to last? Are you worried about a collapse there? And if so, what would be the outcome, the ramifications of that?
Thanks a lot, Mike. Yeah, I think those are the questions that we are currently struggling. The first thing is, I think we are still yet to fully understand the impact of the Gen Zs and the protests and the governance issues being raised. And more importantly, I think, as I said earlier, the government or the president and his people gave us the old response of the mainstream parties. And we are trying to see the connection between these protests and what has come out of that as that broad-based government. These major protests against planned for the month of August, and most of these protests have been calling for the government to the president to resign and the deputy and all that, and also the mixed signals that the opposition is sending. As I said, the opposition leader is disowning the nominees to the cabinet. He's saying they have gone there in the individual right. The Secretary General to the opposition party issued a statement saying that they have not entered into any formal coalition with the government. The opposition leader, Raila Odinga, the government has formally submitted his candidature to succeed the African Union Commission chair. So those are the background movements that maybe will determine. But my hunch is that they're actually in a partnership of political convenience, and maybe because the two major political formations, at least the ones which are known, are working together. Their numbers are actually very big in the legislature, and any agenda, if that partnership reflects in the legislative working, maybe it will. The other destabilizing factors which are coming up now is that there is actually media discussions of an impeachment motion against the deputy president. And if the coalition partners line up their numbers, they would very easily impeach the deputy president, because the 2/3 which are required at the Senate for that final vote, plus the simple majority for holding the motion from the National Assembly, those are numbers they can easily get together. But there's a lot that is not accurate, and which is accurate that you will not be able to tell in the Kenyan political scenes. But in my judgment, the fact that Ruto has Raila on his side is in my view, a stabilizing has a stabilizing effect on the governance process, not necessarily for good reasons, but it means that Ruto will have space to do some governance work before the next storm comes in. Yeah, so maybe that's what I can say about the current issues in Kenya.
Thank you. Thanks very much. We'll watch with interest as we watch, I think, the path of democracy all over Africa, the 2 steps forward and the occasional 1 step back, makes for a very interesting experience. I'm going to start wrapping up now. Just see that there's a new question come in about the most meaningful points and spaces for engagement and the role of civil society. That's what we're doing today, I think, one of those things. So where does civil society fit into this? I'm going to give that one to you initially, Lukhona, seeing as you are with a civil society organization.
No, thanks, Mike. I think as civil society, we need to probably have a come to Jesus moment, if I was to use that phrase, in terms of what is it that we think we want to endow the country with in the next 5 years. My reading of the previous election is that the political center is broken. And that political center used to be in the visionary statement of the ANC, you know, and everybody has some buy-in to that vision of a non-sexist, non-racial, you know, democratic, equal, and prosperous society. That's the offering of the ANC. And what we have seen now is what somebody called in our meeting divergence. And that the duty of leadership in this moment is not to follow the divergence. So it's not to follow the politics of regionalism, of identity, of ethnicism, but is to say, how do we hold, and I think this ties up to the question around the national dialogue, how do we hold space for the country in a meaningful way that recenters a vision for society that is about nation building, that is about solidarity, that is about unity, that is about transformation, because you've got to transform this society for you to get to a point where everybody feels that they've got a stake in the country. And I think that's going to be the duty of civil society. I know that we diverge even amongst ourselves as civil society. We then have to ask the difficult questions. I mean, Jaap was referring to the Municipal Structures Amendment Bill. What is our posture on that? What is our posture on electoral thresholds, which is what the bill seeks to introduce? There are even other many more compelling questions that are in the bill, which is what I call a 2-year holiday to institute a motion of no confidence against the speaker, the chief whip, and so on. And of course, Salga has said that they want to add the mayor because the mayor is not in the amendment bill. So I think there are fundamental questions that are going to confront civil society around electoral reforms. What are the submissions we make to the new committee well, new in inverted commas, the new committee that is, is starting off the work. What is the vision we have for our electoral system? I know in civil society, for example, we disagree whether or not we should have a presidential system. And I still feel that if at least we elected the president directly, it even makes the constitution of government even much more easier. And it protects the executive to a large degree to the whims of parliament. And, you'd have to then remove section 102 of the constitution. This is what I've been arguing. And you'd have to leave section 89, which would be the impeachment clause. But parliament can't lose confidence in a president that they did not elect, because that president would have been elected by citizens. So these are some of the questions I think as civil society we need to talk about. When we look at local government, the failures of local government, the inability for local government to deliver services. I mean, if you have water, electricity, and Wi-Fi, or in a day, you probably are very, very lucky, because that's the collapse of local government, where we do not get the services that which we pay for. And as we move towards 2026, what are the empowering conversations? Because I detest the term voter education. So we do at the Rivonia Circle what we call voter conversations. What are the kind of conversations we have with voters in the build-up to 2026 in ensuring that we get as empowered municipalities as possible? Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. In the interest of time, seeing as we are almost approaching 12:30 and we've kept the time so well so far this morning, I'm going to begin to wrap it up at that point. First of all, by thanking the 5 speakers for their excellent inputs and for keeping to time so that we could cover so much ground. That's very much appreciated. I also want to thank, obviously, all of you who have joined us this morning. It was a very good audience. I think at one stage we hit about 150 people, and a very diverse audience, both within this country and from abroad. I noticed quite a number of people joining us from foreign parts, always very, very welcome, and also for sharing some of your insights in the chat box there. To the team at the Dullah Omar Institute, and in particular, Tinashe Chigwata for putting this together. It was great to be working with you, and I hope that we can do so again in the future. My colleague at CPLO, Sue Doherty, has also been helpful in the background, getting the invitations out and so on. I'd like to thank very, very much the Hans Seidel Foundation, Karen, April in Johannesburg, Yolanda, Nessie down here in Cape Town for their input and for the continuing support that the HSF gives both to the Omar Institute and to the Catholic Parliamentary Liaison Office. We really do appreciate it very, very much. And it's not only financial support, it's also sharing of information and insights and expertise, in this case from Germany. And we've had many discussions around coalition issues. We've benefited from the insights of various German experts on this question as well. So that partnership is very highly valued. The recording will be made available in due course on the Dullah Omar Institute website. And I noticed a lot of people did forward their email addresses to receive copies. I think you can deal directly with the Institute on that. One aspect that we did not touch on is the effect of the Government of National Unity on Parliament. For every ministry, there's a portfolio committee in Parliament. And we now have the interesting situation where we have this mix of ministers from different parties, and we have a mix of portfolio committee chairs from a number of different parties as well. So there's going to be quite a shake-up in the way that Parliament acts, carries out its duties, and hopefully there's going to be a much higher level of accountability. So I'm happy to say that in about 3 weeks from now, my organization, together with Freedom Under Law, will be putting together a roundtable discussion, hybrid webinar, to examine what all of this means for Parliament. We've also got the shared presiding officers and so on. We're finalizing the speakers and we're finalizing the date, but it's likely to be either the 20th or the 21st of August. Invitations will be issued in the normal way. Those of you who are not on the mailing list of either my organization or Freedom Under Law, you're welcome just to check on the CPLO website, cplo.org.za. But we'll try to get those invites out as widely as we can so that we can look at the ramifications of the GNU for our legislature. Please do take a minute before you depart to fill in that evaluation. It has been posted a couple of times in the chat box. It won't take you very long at all. And it's very, very useful to all of us. And I think that that is all. So once again, with thanks to everybody, I wish you a good day, a good week, and I wish the GNU the best of luck. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks for sharing, Mike.